Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. The year is 1997. Intel's MMX marketing machine finally got to you and you're sitting here with your Compaq DeskPro 2000. The computer featuring an Intel MMX CPU running at 166 MHz. You're also covered in the multimedia department with this quad-speed CD-ROM and the Sound Blaster 16. Anxious to see what the machine can do, you start up Monster Truck Madness, a really cool game from Microsoft that will really show the potential of this machine. So let's start the race and see how she will perform. But before we do that, I just want to remind everybody that it is GPUJune this month, meaning that a whole bunch of YouTubers are doing GPU related videos. Now, GPUJune is the brainchild of Nathan Meyer, aka Pixel Pipes. If you haven't checked out his channel yet, please do, because not only does he seem like a really nice guy, but he has excellent content relating everything GPU. Definitely worth watching. I will also add a link into the description of the official GPUJune playlist, so definitely check that out as well. But now, back to our Compaq DeskPro and Monster Truck Madness. Oh man, you are definitely excited about this. And everything starts out well. You're behind the cockpit, you are starting up your machine, but as soon as you change the view, you start to notice something. The game is basically grinding to a halt, maxing out at around 5 frames per second. This is becoming very painful to watch, so let's put this out of its misery. So what has happened here? Well, we've come to the sad realization that the CPU alone will not cut it anymore. And to turn this PC into the gaming beast you've always wanted, we need something extra. And that extra is this little card here that we're going to be adding to the machine. The 3DFX Voodoo Rush. Whether or not this will turn out to be a good idea, you will find out in this video. Now there is some logic why I opted for this Compaq DeskPro with the Intel Pentium 166 MHz CPU, because I wanted to have a computer which wasn't too fast, and I wanted to have a 3D card that isn't really talked about all that much, and that is the 3DFX Voodoo Rush card that you see here. Now everybody is familiar with the 3DFX Voodoo 1 card, the initial product offering from 3DFX, which kind of revolutionized the whole 3D gaming world in the PC. Now the problem with this card was that you needed to have an additional 2D card to combine it with the 3D card, meaning you needed to have a pass-through cable that you would hook up to the 3DFX card, loop it back to your 2D card, and then enter your monitor in the 3D card. That basically means that the 3DFX Voodoo card could display both the 3D part and it could feed back the 2D part from your original video card. But yeah, in this video we're going to be talking about the 3DFX failed attempt at producing a follow-up for the hugely popular Voodoo 1 card, and this is the Voodoo Rush. It's hated by many, but I still think it's a pretty interesting card to cover here on the channel. Now released in 1997, shortly after the Voodoo 1, this card also has the same 3DFX chips, but it also has a 2D chip. Unfortunately, these 2D and 3D chips also have to share the same bandwidth, meaning that you get about 10 to 15% drop in performance. And because it wasn't very popular, it was discontinued very early on. Now, the idea of putting a 2D chip and a 3D chip on one card isn't a novel idea, but it definitely has some drawbacks in terms of performance here. And that was reflected in a lot of gaming performance, where the Voodoo Rush would perform considerably worse than the Voodoo 1 card. Also, the 2D performance of the 2D chip here, provided by Alliance Semiconductor, wasn't the best 2D experience out there. Because what you need to remember is that in 1997, a crisp 2D image on a CRT monitor was also a thing. I mean, Matrox, for example, here with this Mystique or with the Millennium, was able to produce really crisp 2D images, whereas most video cards were lacking in that department. Now, the Voodoo Rush also faced competition from other cards, including this Rendition Verite 2100 chip, which could be found on the Diamond Stealth ST2 S220 card. This was offered at a much lower price point than the Voodoo Rush with comparable 3D performance. We also had the NVIDIA Riva 128 chipset, which was found on the iconic Diamond Viper V330 PCI card from 1997, which would lead on to evolve into the TNT and the TNT2 chipsets. So yeah, what 3DFX was expecting to be its strength, namely the fact that you have all of the video outputs on a single card without the need of having a separate 2D and 3D card, also turned out to be its most weakness. Now, there were a couple of different Rush cards out there. Mine used a 2D chip from Alliance Semiconductor, the ProMotion AT25. It is branded Yakumo. At least this BIOS chip is. I think this is also the name of the vendor. There is a feature connector and a VMI connector on the card. I'm expecting this can be used for some kind of hardware MPEG decoding or something. And next to the 2D chip, there is an empty socket. I'm not really sure what that is for. And of course, the card is PCI. Now, after the Voodoo Rush, 3DFX continued to deliver a 3D only graphics card with the Voodoo 2, which was again hugely popular due to its excellent performance and its SLI capabilities, allowing you to combine two Voodoo 2 cards in a single system. But that doesn't mean that 3DFX abandoned the idea of putting a 2D and 3D chip on one card altogether. Because after the Voodoo 2, 3DFX also released the Banshee. Now, this one wasn't also hugely popular, but it was definitely a step up from the Voodoo Rush. It was a little bit slower than the Voodoo 2, but it offered decent performance. And then with the Voodoo 3 card, 3DFX really started to shine, and here they had the most optimal configuration in terms of having both 2D and 3D on a single card. Now, there are a couple of different versions and different vendors that produce these Voodoo Rush cards. The one that you're seeing here is what is called a single planar card, meaning that everything is on the same card, both the 2D and the 3D part. Other vendors like Hercules came up with this Stingray 128 3D, which followed a dual planar system, where you had one card which was basically responsible for the 2D part, and then kind of an add-on card that clipped onto the video card would provide the 3D part. Now, the card that I have here is a pretty long card, so it's not sure that it will fit in every system, but there are definitely Voodoo Rush cards out there that were a lot more optimized in terms of space, making it so that they could produce video cards on a much smaller form factor. But before we dive into the performance of the Rush, I would like to talk a little bit about the Compaq DeskPro that I have here. Released around the same time in 1997, it was a desktop or mini tower computer that featured an Intel Pentium MMX CPU. It was right about the $1,300 mark in about, September of 1997, excluding monitor. And while it definitely wasn't the fastest machine out there, because you started to see the Pentium 2 popping up at around this time period, it definitely wasn't a turd. But however, as soon as you started playing games on this thing, you would notice that, for example, Quake here runs pretty well in low resolutions. But as soon as you bump up the resolution and you try to see more details in the game, you would see that the PC would really struggle. And this doesn't have anything to do with the actual CPU which is in here, but it's the lacking of the 3D capabilities of this machine. And it's not only with Quake that you see this. For example, Midtown Madness was also a game around this time period, which would theoretically work on a machine like this. But you know, when you go into the options and you select the graphic options, you see that it already recommends a kind of medium setting based on the graphics card which is in this PC, which isn't 3D accelerated at all. And around this time, I mean, a lot of these games really became sensitive to that 3D acceleration, building in specific routines not only for 3D effects but for other direct 3D supported video cards. And the result here is that with a poor video card in this system, games would, you know, not really run all that well. They would need to be run at low resolutions. You would have low frame rates, making it a horrible experience to play games like this. And to make matters worse, I mean, certain games just wouldn't run at all if you didn't have a 3D acceleration card in your computer. Motocross Madness, for example, published by Microsoft, clearly states that it requires a 3D accelerator card, a multimedia PC with a 4 megabyte 3D card. No 3D card, no game. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that there is only a handful of games that came around in around 1996, 1997 that were actually enjoyable without a 3D acceleration card. Carmageddon, for example, is a game that we used to play a lot when we were kids. We didn't have a 3D accelerator card when Carmageddon was released. Eventually, all of us got a 3D FX card and we were blown away by the difference in image quality. But a game like Carmageddon, for example, is perfectly playable without a 3D FX card. You just need to do with a low resolution and the low texture quality. But definitely a lot of fun. But now let's look at the actual PC here. So we got the Intel Pentium MMX, we have the Compaq DeskPro logo, we have a disk drive, we have a power LED, hard drive LED, and a quad speed CD-ROM drive. That's basically it, and a power button. No reset button. On the back, we see the power supply, 230 volts. We have a serial port, a parallel port. We have PS2 ports for the mouse and the keyboard. We have two USB ports. I think these are 1.0 ports. And we have a VGA card built in. We have a sound card and a networking card. So pretty basic stuff. Now, Compaq used to work with GBL a lot, and I have to say these speakers are really phenomenal. I don't know if these are the speakers that came with this PC original, because I have seen different GBL Pro speakers, but these are actually really good. But in order to see why this PC is behaving so poorly with all these 3D games, we need to open her up. And what we see inside is first a couple of expansion cards. We have a 3-COM networking card and a Sound Blaster 16. So let's get these out of the way. So yeah, good quality 3-COM Etherlink card. You can't do anything wrong with that. And in the sound department, we have the iconic Sound Blaster 16, also a really good card. But the real culprit that is responsible for the poor gaming performance is hiding away beneath this sticker here. So let's carefully remove it. And what we see here is the S3 Trio 64 V2GX embedded video card. Now, this is not a 3D card. I mean, this is a perfectly good card for 2D and MS-DOS performance, but it doesn't have any features in terms of 3D. So despite the fact that this computer is equipped with 82 megabytes of RAM and that we have a fairly decent CPU with the Intel Pentium MMX 166 MHz behind this huge passive heatsink, we do have some expansion here. So we have one PCI slot and 3 ISA slots on the one side, and then 2 additional PCI slots here. So we can upgrade the PC. We could have tried upgrading the CPU for this machine. I'm pretty sure that Compaq at one point had a 233 megahertz MMX offering on the Compaq DeskPro 2000, but I mean, in 1997, this would have cost a lot of money and it wouldn't have provided any 3D acceleration at all, because in 1997, that could have only come from a 3D video card like this one. Now, the Voodoo Rush card that I have here is pretty big, so I can put it here, but I couldn't, for example, put it on the other side just because the form factor of the card. So you need to take that into account if you are planning on using a Voodoo Rush in your system. You need to have sufficient space, which luckily we have here in the Compaq DeskPro. So now with our 3D card installed, let's enable the 3D hardware acceleration and run Monster Truck Madness again. And you should see a huge difference. So we're in the cockpit, I'm going to the external view, and just look at how, fluent the graphics are. I mean, we are definitely getting around 15, perhaps 20 FPS at this point, which is not ideal by any stretch, but it is definitely playable. And I can assure you, if you were 17 or 18 years old in 1997, this would have blown your mind. And now finally, Motocross Madness, published by Microsoft, is running now with the 3DFX 3D accelerator. Finally, we get to play this game on the Compaq. And just look at those 3D graphics, these very, distinctive images that you always associate with 3DFX video cards. Yeah, really, really nice to see. And all thanks to these two little 3DFX chips on the Voodoo Rush card. But because we're dealing with the Voodoo Rush, we should experience some other issues. For example, on certain games, what I would experience is that the 3DFX logo would simply hang. Instead of going into the actual game, it would be stuck here. And no matter what I did, I couldn't get out of this. Now, you could typically get out of this by mucking around with different drivers and depending on the game, certain settings, but it is quite of a hassle, to be honest. Other games, for example, like Need for Speed, simply refuse to start at all and kind of threw you back into the Windows desktop for a reason. So yeah, again, probably driver related, because with other drivers I was able to run it. Same with GL Quake. So here I had this flickering on the 3DFX logo and also inside the game. So the flickering that you're seeing here is not, the camera not syncing up to the refresh rate of the monitor, but it's actually, artifacts that you see while playing the game in real life. So yeah, the Voodoo Rush isn't without any issues. But other games, for example, like Colin McRae Rally that you see here, ran perfectly fine on the Voodoo Rush, and it was a really enjoyable experience. Now, despite this being a game from 1998, it runs really, really well on this 1997 computer. I mean, with the 3D acceleration, this really offers excellent gameplay and graphics. A really fun game to play on this type of machine. Another really cool game I thought at the time, and still do, is Moto Racer, which is actually fully direct 3D accelerated. So with a 3D card like the Voodoo Rush, this should offer a fairly good experience. And that's what we're going to be seeing here. I mean, again, the graphics are really good, and it's not only the high resolution quote-unquote graphics that you see here, but I mean, it's the actual frame rate of the game. I mean, first lap was a little bit scruffy on my end, but once I got into the game, I mean, I thought it was really enjoyable. I think the frame rate was really good, the gameplay was excellent, and this is for me the kind of 3D FX effect that you had with these types of games. So again, definitely an enjoyable experience. Next up, I tried Tomb Raider, the 3DFX version. I don't know if this one has kind of official Voodoo Rush support, but I did find that the game was a little bit lacking in the FPS department. I mean, the graphics were okay and it was playable, but it definitely wasn't 30 FPS. Now, I don't know if this is a driver issue or another configuration issue, but yeah, I was kind of disappointed to see this. Now, the type of drivers that you will use with the Voodoo Rush will determine how much game compatibility that you will get. I ended up opting for this MRF Voodoo Rush 1.0 driver, which is in the 3DFX download page that I will link into the description. It's not the standard reference drivers from 3DFX, but it is a special driver that somebody created, and I have to say I have had lots of success with it. I was able to run GL Quake without the flickering. So as you can see here, GL Quake is running perfectly fine on the Compaq, no more flickering. Another important thing to note is that the 3DFX reference drivers will tend to overclock the 2D chip on the Voodoo Rush, meaning that you will get these weird artifacts like you can see here. And the only way out of this is to change a registry value where a certain clock is set to 72, and if you set it to 60, then all of a sudden after a reboot you will begin to see a normal screen again. Yeah, so for me this is just one of many inconveniences that you will encounter when working with this Voodoo Rush, something that you will not have with a traditional Voodoo 1 or Voodoo 2 card. It's not that you can't overcome these types of issues, but you know, it is pretty daunting to just keep on, you know, trying out different drivers, settings just to make your Windows desktop work. I even thought at one point that the Voodoo Rush card killed off my LCD monitor because all of a sudden it was acting really strange. But all is forgiven obviously as soon as you start playing these 3D games on the machine. Formula 1 Racing Simulation, for example, is a nice little racing game that works really well with the Voodoo Rush and this Compaq. As a Formula 1 racing simulation enthusiast, these things are, you know, really fun to play as far as I'm concerned, and yeah, it just shows you a little bit of the potential of the Voodoo Rush card. You do need to put things into low settings because, you know, it is also CPU bound to a certain degree, and the Voodoo Rush is kind of hitting its limits here, but it's definitely playable. Carmageddon, for example, the 3DFX version is very demanding on any type of hardware. I don't think I have ever seen Carmageddon 3DFX version running smoothly on any system. I just purchased Carmageddon 3DFX and I played it on my Core i7 and DOS box, and even there it is kind of sluggish. It's not as sluggish as this, but yeah, you can definitely see that it's not 100% optimized for the hardware that it has at hand. But yeah, still a very enjoyable game and a huge upgrade in the graphics department from the original Carmageddon version that we saw earlier in the video. So what are my conclusions? I think it's a very interesting card to have, the Voodoo Rush. You don't come across these all that often. In terms of compatibility, I would prefer to work with a Voodoo 1 or a Voodoo 2. But still, it was a really nice experience working with the card, seeing how it performed on the Compaq DeskPro. Enjoyed playing some games, and I really hope you've enjoyed this little video on the Voodoo Rush. Like always, if you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing to the channel, hit the like button, and feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Hope to see you guys next time. Bye bye.